The 2010s were a strange time for horror. Streaming hadn't completely taken over yet, social media wasn't driving taste, and most of these films weren't designed to go viral or explain themselves in 60 seconds. This was modern horror, before the current wave. Smaller movies made on the margins that relied on atmosphere, discomfort, and slow escalation, instead of spectacle or franchise momentum. Some of these titles built quiet followings. Others slipped through the cracks entirely. But they all share something in common. They commit to their tone, they trust the audience, and they aren't in a hurry to hold your hand. If you missed them the first time around, now's the moment to catch up. Kill List, 2011. Two former soldiers now working as contract killers accept a job meant to solve their mounting financial problems. The assignment seems straightforward, a series of targets provided by a shadowy client. But each killing reveals something deeply unsettling. The people they're sent to eliminate behave strangely, sometimes grateful, as if they know what's coming. What begins as a grounded crime story slowly unravels into something far more disturbing. The film follows the disintegration of both men as their work grows more ritualistic and less rational. Neil Maskell and Michael Smiley play the leads with convincing familiarity, their banter and resentment feeling lived in rather than scripted. Mayanna Buring adds domestic tension as a partner increasingly alarmed by the psychological toll the job is taking. The performances keep everything rooted in reality, even as the narrative begins to slip out of reach. Violence is abrupt and ugly, staged with a blunt, matter-of-fact intensity that avoids stylization. Wheatley shoots the action with near-documentary immediacy, making each encounter feel unavoidable, rather than sensational. As the story progresses, imagery and structure shift toward folk horror. Symbols, gatherings, and roles that suggest the men were never in control of the job to begin with. Kill List is deliberately destabilizing. It asks the audience to follow familiar genre ground only to quietly remove the map. The final act abandons explanation in favor of implication, forcing viewers to reconsider everything that came before. It's demanding, grim, and intentionally disorienting, but deeply effective. A modern British horror film that lingers because it refuses comfort, clarity, or easy meaning. The Eyes of My Mother, 2016. A young girl grows up on a quiet farm, taught anatomy and care by her mother, a former surgeon. When a sudden act of violence shatters that world, the child is left to develop in near-total isolation, absorbing lessons about the body and affection without any emotional framework to balance them. Years later, as an adult, she seeks connection the only way she understands, through control, imitation, and deeply warped attempts at closeness. The film unfolds like a grim fairy tale, stripped of sentiment and explanation. Its central performance is restrained and unsettling, built on stillness rather than outbursts. The character isn't portrayed as a monster in the traditional sense, but as someone whose emotional wiring never had a chance to form normally. That quiet approach makes her actions more disturbing than any overt villainy. Shot in stark black and white, the imagery is precise and severe. Pastoral landscapes feel empty rather than peaceful, and interiors are framed to emphasize confinement and routine. Violence, when it appears, is handled with clinical detachment, often implied, sometimes brief, never sensationalized. The sound design leans heavily on silence, allowing small noises to land with disproportionate weight. The Eyes of My Mother is not an easy watch, but it's a controlled and purposeful one. It explores how isolation and trauma can distort empathy beyond repair, presenting horror as something learned rather than summoned. Bleak, intimate, and deeply unsettling, it leaves its impact through mood and implication, rather than excess. Baskin, 2015. A group of Turkish police officers responds to a routine late-night call, expecting nothing more than a minor disturbance. Instead, they wander into an abandoned building that feels wrong the moment they step inside. What they find isn't a crime scene, but something closer to a threshold. Rules dissolve, time loses meaning, and the officers realize they've entered a space shaped by belief, ritual, and punishment. The film begins grounded and almost casual, with natural banter and familiar authority dynamics among the officers. That normalcy makes the descent more effective. As the night deepens, the environment turns hostile, and the group's confidence collapses into confusion and fear. One officer seems disturbingly connected to what awaits them, hinting that this encounter may not be random at all. Visually, Baskin leans into nightmare logic rather than clear geography. Corridors loop, spaces feel unreal, and lighting washes everything in sickly reds and shadows. Practical effects are front and center, creating imagery that's confrontational and deliberately uncomfortable without relying on jump scares. The cult leader at the center of it all becomes a focal point, calm and imposing, embodying authority twisted into something ritualistic. Baskin isn't subtle, and it isn't gentle. It's designed to overwhelm, trapping both its characters and the audience in a sustained sense of dread. While its extremity won't be for everyone, the film stands out for committing fully to its vision. It's less about narrative clarity than atmosphere and inevitability. A descent that feels ordained from the moment the door closes behind them. The Blackcoat's Daughter, 2015. Winter break empties a boarding school, leaving two students behind in near-total isolation. Snow piles up outside, the halls fall silent, and something unseen lingers in the building with them. In a separate thread, a young woman makes her way toward the school under unclear circumstances, her journey marked by exhaustion and quiet determination. The connection between these stories isn't immediately obvious, but it's deliberate. The film moves slowly, letting mood do the heavy lifting. Long stretches pass with almost no dialogue, forcing attention onto small details. Footsteps echoing in empty corridors, distant sounds with no clear source, behavior that feels slightly off before it becomes alarming. Performances are restrained and internal, emphasizing emotional damage and loneliness rather than overt fear. Visually, everything is drained and cold. Snow, darkness, and negative space dominate the frame, making the school feel less like a refuge and more like a holding place. The horror rarely announces itself. Violence is mostly implied, and the supernatural presence is suggested through behavior, imagery, and atmosphere rather than effects. When answers come, they're unsettling not because of spectacle, but because of what they confirm. The Blackcoat's Daughter asks for patience and attention. Its structure withholds clarity until the end, trusting viewers to sit with discomfort and uncertainty. The payoff isn't explosive, it's bleak and quietly devastating. A deliberately austere film that uses silence, isolation, and inevitability to create lasting unease rather than momentary shock. A Dark Song, 2016. A grieving woman isolates herself in a remote house with an occult specialist, committing to a long, rigid ritual meant to reach beyond the physical world. The process isn't symbolic or theatrical, it's procedural, exhausting, and dangerous, demanding total obedience to rules that leave no room for doubt or weakness. What she hopes to gain is personal and devastating, while the man guiding her carries motives that are far less clear. The film unfolds almost entirely between two people, turning their uneasy partnership into the core source of tension. Their dynamic constantly shifts, professional, adversarial, dependent, as days blur together and the ritual begins to take a visible toll. Conversations feel transactional at first, then increasingly strained as isolation and fear set in. Trust becomes fragile, but abandoning the process is no longer an option. Rather than rushing toward spectacle, the story emphasizes duration and attrition. Strange sounds, subtle changes in behavior, and creeping environmental details signal that something is working, even if the characters can't fully understand what they've invited in. The house itself feels less like a location and more like a sealed system, cut off from outside logic. When the supernatural finally asserts itself in full, it feels earned rather than indulgent. The payoff carries weight because of the discipline leading up to it. A Dark Song treats occult practice as labor rather than fantasy, creating a grim, immersive experience that values commitment over comfort. It's demanding, unsettling, and singular in its focus, standing apart from more conventional possession or ritual stories. The Invitation, 2015. A man accepts an invitation to a dinner party hosted by his ex-wife and her new husband, his first time seeing them since the death of his child. The gathering is meant to be a step toward closure, but something feels wrong almost immediately. The hosts are unusually calm, their friends seem rehearsed, and small details begin to suggest the night has an unspoken purpose. The question becomes whether the tension comes from unresolved grief or a real growing threat. The film is structured entirely around doubt. Viewers are locked into the protagonist's perspective, sharing his uncertainty, as every interaction can be read two ways. Performances are key here. Nothing is played overtly sinister. Politeness, forced warmth, and awkward pauses do most of the work, allowing paranoia to build naturally rather than through obvious warning signs. The single-house setting is used with precision. Rooms feel tighter as the night goes on, exits subtly disappear, and casual conversation becomes a form of pressure. The direction favors patience over escalation, letting discomfort accumulate through glances, silences, and social friction. When violence finally intrudes, it's abrupt and grounded, shattering the illusion of normalcy the evening has maintained. The invitation succeeds because it trusts restraint. It understands that fear often comes from not knowing whether you're overreacting until it's too late. By the time its full scope is revealed, the film has already done the harder work, making the audience live inside that uncertainty. Controlled, tense, and quietly devastating, it's a modern thriller that proves atmosphere can be more unsettling than spectacle. Absentia, 2011. After 7 years with no answers, a woman prepares to have her missing husband legally declared dead. Her sister, newly sober and trying to rebuild her life, comes to stay and help her through the process. Just outside their apartment is a dark pedestrian tunnel, ignored by most, avoided by locals, that seems connected to a pattern of disappearances, stretching back decades. As paperwork moves forward, strange encounters suggest the husband's fate may not have been random at all. The film keeps its focus tight and personal. The sisters' strained relationship carries as much weight as the mystery itself, grounding the story in grief, guilt, and unfinished business. Conversations feel natural, sometimes awkward, sometimes tender, making the creeping unease feel rooted in real life, rather than genre mechanics. The tunnel becomes the center of gravity, an unremarkable stretch of concrete that feels increasingly wrong the longer the film lingers on it. Horror is built here through absence and suggestion, sounds without sources, glimpses that vanish too quickly, moments that could be stress or something else entirely. Effects are minimal and used sparingly, letting implication do the work. Absentia succeeds by embracing limitation. Its low budget forces restraint, and that restraint becomes the film's strength. It treats loss as an open wound and horror as something that feeds on what people leave unresolved. Rough around the edges but quietly unsettling, it's a small, focused film that proves atmosphere and emotion can be far more disturbing than spectacle. The Devil's Candy, 2015. A painter moves his family into a rural Texas house hoping for a fresh start, only to discover its violent past isn't finished with them. As he works, his art grows darker and more obsessive, fueled by intrusive visions he can't explain. At the same time, a troubled former resident, convinced the house still belongs to him, begins drifting back toward it, drawn by the same unseen influence. What unfolds isn't a single haunting, but two people being pulled in opposite ways by the same force. Director Sean Byrne frames the story around possession as a slow erosion rather than a sudden takeover. Ethan Embry plays the artist with mounting desperation, caught between creative release and the fear that something else is guiding his hand. Pruitt Taylor Vince is quietly devastating as the unstable outsider, a man tormented by voices he can't escape, and treated as a threat long before the supernatural confirms it. Shiri Appleby and Kiara Glasgow ground the film as a believable family trying to stay intact while everything around them fractures. Heavy metal isn't just a stylistic choice, it's part of the film's nervous system. Distorted guitars bleed into the score, artwork, and sound design, turning creativity into a conduit for something corrosive. The horror stays restrained. Brief flashes of violence, ominous imagery, and an oppressive use of sound rather than constant shocks. When things finally turn physical, it feels earned and dangerous, rather than excessive. The Devil's Candy works because it treats possession as intimate and personal. It's less about evil invading a home than about how grief, obsession, and untreated damage leave doors open. Lean, tense, and emotionally grounded, it's a modern horror film that trusts mood and character over spectacle, and sticks with you long after the noise fades. They Look Like People, 2015. A man on the edge of a breakdown reconnects with an old friend, hoping the familiarity will help him steady himself. Instead, his private fears begin to surface. He's convinced something is wrong with the world, that people are being replaced, and that violence is inevitable. The question isn't just whether he's right, but how far his belief will push him. The film centers on friendship rather than mystery. The bond between the two men feels lived in and sincere, built on shared history and quiet loyalty. One is trying to rebuild his life, the other is unraveling, and their time together becomes a fragile balancing act between care and fear. Every conversation carries the tension of not knowing what should be said, or what might trigger something irreversible. There are no elaborate set pieces or obvious threats. Unease comes from suggestion, distorted phone calls, half-glimpsed changes, preparations that seem defensive until they don't. Sound design does much of the heavy lifting, blurring the line between internal panic and external danger. The film never rushes to explain what's real, allowing doubt to linger scene after scene. What makes the experience resonate is its restraint. Violence is minimal, the imagery spare, but the emotional stakes are heavy. The story works equally well as psychological horror or as a compassionate look at mental health and trust under strain. They Look Like People is intimate, unsettling, and quietly devastating, proving tension doesn't need spectacle to cut deep. The Canal, 2014. A film archivist working with early crime footage uncovers a disturbing connection between his home and a murder committed there decades earlier. At the same time, his marriage begins to unravel, and his grip on daily life weakens. When his wife disappears, suspicion points toward him, but he becomes convinced something tied to the house and the nearby canal is responsible. Rather than rushing toward answers, the story sinks into instability. The protagonist's research blurs past and present, with grainy archival images bleeding into his waking life. Whether these discoveries represent a genuine haunting or a mind collapsing under stress is never made clear, and the film is careful not to rush that ambiguity. The central performance carries this uncertainty, playing grief, obsession, and fear as overlapping states rather than separate beats. The setting does much of the heavy lifting. The canal itself feels like a boundary, still water hiding history, decay just out of sight. Old film reels, dark rooms, and flickering projections create an atmosphere where time feels unreliable. Supernatural elements appear sparingly, often suggested through sound, shadow, or incomplete images rather than direct confrontation. The canal works best as a slow erosion of certainty. It's less about shocks than about the fear of losing trust in your own perceptions. By grounding its horror in domestic collapse and historical residue, the film builds a quiet, persistent dread that lingers well after it ends. An underseen psychological horror that rewards attention and patience. If you love discovering forgotten horror and cult cinema, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the films time forgot. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.